Hello, everybody. Welcome to the next user group. I have a quick touch base here. So if you're in any one of these groups, congrats, you've came to the right place. We also have, again, just calling out the names. So if you've seen those pictures, you probably looked at the header. We do have the ability to look at reviews now. So if you do want to give us feedback, even not directly, or just want to post here, you can also do that as well. Each group does have a separate score. But feel free to reach out to us or post on there based on what you want to see, how you've liked it going so far. Any sort of feedback is awesome. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Tom to give a talk on Azure Local. And Tom, would you like speakers to raise their hand, come off mute, ask in chat?
We have a small enough audience where we could address all these in line.
Cool.
And yeah, so don't hesitate. Just let me know if you got any questions. Please let me know if you can see my screen. I started sharing it now, so it should be visible to you.
Yep, got it.
Awesome. All right, so yeah, the topic du jour today is Azure Local and kind of how it came to be, what is, our story, right? But we're always looking and I'm part of Microsoft organization, so this is presented from that perspective, right? We're looking to help people move to Azure. Lots of goodness in running various solutions in Azure. There's some also great cost savings if you got legacy infrastructure so that you could run extended security updates for free for those machines if they are hosted in Azure. If Azure is not the right place because you may have dependencies, latencies, and certain requirements that cannot be really met, then you really do have an option to move to Azure Local, and that's going to be our topic for today. But I just want to kind of give you the all-up sort of view, and of course, anything that you got in legacy that's on-prem, you can always update them. Otherwise, you got to buy those extended security updates. But in terms of Azure Local, right, and kind of the strategy at the edge, right, for years, Microsoft has released different products. We have Azure Stack Hub, we have Azure Stack HCI, now rebranded as Local, and some other flavors of this solution. And what we realized that by calling these solutions, Stack or Edge, is not really doing justice, because the reality is that the data that these solutions may be operating, maybe at the edge, maybe somewhere buried in a data center, maybe in an infrastructure that is owned by somebody else, and yet you still need to provide certain amount of services, right? And that's really the story for Azure Arc. For those of you that are not familiar with Azure Arc enables you to basically manage the workloads that live outside of Azure. So be it your on-prem server, Windows Server 2025 comes with Azure Arc enabled agent by default, right? And we get a lot of great benefits from being able to really reason on all the data that those particular Arc servers are uploading. Any Kubernetes instances that have a Kubernetes Arc extension installed into them can also be managed. There's a lot of interesting use cases where you could really package like a complete solution into Azure Arc with Kubernetes and bootstrap the deployment of all this kind of through and through in your environment, whatever that may be. So we've gone through the rebranding of Azure Stack HCI to really kind of refocus on where we're going, right? But we really want to bring the benefits of operating Azure to your local data center. That really is the motivation. We wanted to make sure that you have ability to run VMs, container-based apps, and really make sure that your deployments meet the minimal security requirements, right? Oftentimes, customers have been deploying Active Directory, group policy objects, and as well as series of other tooling that really creates part of your security posture. With Azure Local, we realized that we want to start decoupling from Active Directory. You can still use it, but now with Azure Local, we have ability to really manage your security at scale, regardless where the assets live, right? And so that's all part of how we see this stack evolving. But Azure Local, right, is really comprised of the hardware layer, which there is a hardware catalog that you purchase things through Most companies have relationships with hardware vendors. They can talk to them. So you get your hardware from your provider, and oftentimes that will include special extensions that then allow you to kind of manage it all with a couple of clicks from the cloud. The idea is that when we layer local on top of that and provide you with that full lifecycle management for Azure Local, so that's basically creating VMs, stopping, starting, deleting them. Those functions are now really available on Local as a platform. It gives you a way to really start moving away from other more expensive hypervisors, while at the same time really taking advantage of the cloud infrastructure and the power that brings by being able to consolidate all the asset data into single pane of glass if you wanted to. It doesn't have to be, but that's typically what customers want. Is I want to know how well my infrastructure is running, and on top of that, you'll be able to run Kubernetes. You'll be able to run Windows, Linux VMs. We do actually have specialized scenarios for Azure Local where we are able to deploy now Azure Virtual Desktop. And it's a very interesting solution because it really obviates the need for you to really manage that control plane. Just out of curiosity, anybody here on the call ever deployed remote desktop services on Windows Server? Doesn't look like if anyone has. So, but if you have, you would have learned quickly, whereas we did have a pretty decent VDI solution starting with Windows Server 2012. But the problem was that in order to really fully take advantage of that, and create an enterprise type solution, you needed to basically have like 5 different clusters: your gateway cluster, your portal, your egress, and all the things that come with RDS and anytime, and of course SQL underlying all this. When you manage clusters, that kind of ups the requirements for operational excellence, right? That's why clusters have always been a necessity in enterprise scenarios, but not always desired state for most deployments, right? Because it's tough. So with that, now you actually can get the benefits of it running on just a two node cluster of Azure Local, and run your AVD instances next to your application. Some applications require specialized client software installed, and sometimes that installation is very sensitive to any kind of latencies in between. So that is a great solution. We do also have our Azure IoT operations solution. That's basically IoT in a box, where you can run the different type of data processing gateways on top of Azure Local. It's a bolt-on component. And then we also now enable you to run Azure AI and machine learning type processing at the edge, right? That does not include all of the large language models, right? I get that question often. Azure OpenAI is one of those examples. It's only accessible through the API, not much more beyond that. But for some scenarios where we have, for example, and I may have some videos depending how far we get to, where you could actually detect whether users are properly, placing items around the workspace, making sure that folks are compliant with any kind of safety regulations that your organization may need to require them, right? OSHA penalties are pretty stiff, so most folks always try to make sure that they are largely compliant. And so this is a way for you to enforce that using some tooling. In terms of hybrid distributed infrastructure, right? This is like a category that evolves from year to year. You can see that Microsoft is considered a visionary and a leader in this space. I don't want to bore you with that, but we have invested a lot, and we do have a lot of solutions that target specific industries. Albeit, a lot of these use cases that we'll be discussing, can apply almost to anything that you might be doing out there. But in manufacturing, right, making sure that we can do any kind of real-time detection, predictive maintenance, and just making sure that you have consistent operations, right? I have a couple of customers that have a lot of manufacturing space, and they need local solutions, right? So Azure, whereas they would love to move everything there, is not an option for them. And that's where we are basically leveraging Azure Local to help them with this. In retail, I actually saw some very interesting scenarios that some of our partners are helping us enable. Understanding, what does your retail environment may look like, right? What is the sentiment? What is the foot traffic? And really kind of, capitalizing on the cameras that probably are deployed for security purposes to all these locations to give you some additional insight, how the business is performing. And of course, in healthcare, this is where we have a lot of compliance requirements, right? Making sure that the clinical operational data stays put at the hospital or whatever the venue may be, making sure that that is confidential, and we do apply, our security standards to secure Azure Local kind of as a platform, and I'll show you that in a little bit. But yeah, there's tons of examples, right? That shows you actually some of the screenshots from some of the solutions we have, right? Detecting where people are, how much time they spend in front of an aisle looking at produce. Some of that may be valuable, some of it may be, less so for you. But you do have an option to really manage and observe that locally. So that's a big benefit because you don't have to upload your data into the cloud. But with Azure Local, the way it is operated, right, you have this management and security that is the unified platform that comes from Azure. We have something we call Azure Resource Bridge that basically enables you to effectively execute on the VM lifecycle management. So earlier I talked about the ability to create VMs, delete VMs, change them, right? That's all coming out of that control plane that is in Azure. But then the actual applications themselves, be it VM, Kubernetes, however you configure your Azure Local, stays on premises, right? And it simply reports back into the cloud for the different aspects of Azure Arc that you enabled on Azure Local, as well as the resources that then live on Azure Local, which we'd like you to leverage Arc for those as well, because they do provide you with that single pane of glass I mentioned earlier. Any questions on this connected architecture before I move on? All right, well, no questions. Let's move on. So I mentioned that Azure Stack HCI now replaced by called Azure Local, right? Is really the part that we have released. I actually just heard that we have some of first deployments or solutions being offered for the running the different edge type scenarios. And actually a very exciting part of this solution that if you're working with any customers that have any kind of operational networks as opposed to like traditional networks, things like NERC, SIP networks, SCADA, anything that requires high level of attestation and assurance. And a lot of times these different regulations force customers really to make sure that these systems are not communicating with the outside world, right? And that's where the disconnected operations, something that's currently in preview, is going to come in. And that's pretty exciting. I have a lot of customers in power utility space where they do have these, OT networks, operation technology networks. I have a couple of customers that have pretty extensive infrastructure that has to live in the mines across the world, and these solutions are designed really to be kind of dropped in yet centrally managed. So we're very excited about where this is going for us. So some of the things I wanted to mention, right? So the deployment, whenever you're talking about anything that's got a physical deployment and it's not going to a data center where you have skills and staff that can actually, instantiate this, we are in private preview for offering something that we before only done on a desktop that was called Zero Touch Deployment, whereby we can essentially create a USB disk that you plug into the servers you procure from our partners. And then those servers, once they boot up, they will, they presumably have access to the internet. They'll show up in here. It shows you that 2 nodes that I deployed with the example of this zero touch deployment USB stick show up in here. and then I can configure, how they're managed. This can all be captured inside of Terraform or Azure Arm or Bicep or other infrastructure as code, which I'll show you in a second, has some real great benefits for people that are deploying into multiple environments. And of course, you can design specifically your hardware to reflect your existing standards, typical, recommended practices of partitioning, of the different types of traffic, storage, right? Azure Local is built on Windows Storage Spaces Direct solution, right? So one caveat that I want to make sure everybody understands is that this is not designed to work with traditional data center SAN infrastructures. There are no HBA drivers in Azure Local, right? And that's really done to drive the cost down, whereas SANs have been a great boon to being able to deploy the technology and scale the storage stack to meet whatever the workloads are, right? It's also a big chunk of the cost of these solutions, right? Servers and clusters, the storage tends to be a pretty big line item. And so this solution builds on kind of native Windows capabilities. And by the way, Azure Local is a different operating system. If you have played with it, you would have seen that it gives you very similar interface to what you may be getting with Windows Server Core, where you have a very basic shell experience and you don't load the GUI, all those components that you don't have to put on those end boxes, right? It means there's less stuff to patch, and that means higher securities, right? So we're really trying to kind of drive that down. But in this scenario, it's this whole complete package where we can define all the different things and deploy those templates to these servers, whatever they land, right? So think of having a USB stick sent out, hardware's arrived from the hardware vendor. You get them into Azure, and then you run through this wizard and more or less wind up with a functioning Azure Local instance. And what's beautiful about Azure, right, and that to me is really kind of the big value proposition here, is that everything in a cloud is declarative. That means in order to have a resource, you've got to instantiate it. And by instantiating, you now know that it's there, right? That's where cloud security is very different from on-prem, right? On-prem, we had things like 802.1x, where we're trying to control what devices can connect to your network. The reality that I've worked with many different customers, even in the defense industry, right? It's only when you get to the top tier of these accounts where security is just so important, do they have all these things in place. With the cloud, you simply just have to declare it, and it's there, then it needs to be managed. But the benefit of using the Azure Local resource provider is that we can create a template that can basically guide the deployment, provide all the local IP addresses, and that template can be replicated to any number of locations. Right here, we're talking about retail locations. I used to build solutions like a cluster in a box or maybe branch office in a box, right? This is really kind of in that vein where you now are able to create a repetitive process for deploying these instances and managing them centrally from a cloud, right? So that gives you kind of maximum benefit of not really having to worry too much about how that works on-prem. That's where that validated hardware comes in. But at the end of the day, you wind up with a centralized view of all of your assets, where you'll be able to effectively manage it from one place. So it is meant to really simplify the deployment. On the operations side, right, it's also something that we've been very much focused on making sure we're creating a best experience for the end users, operators. We do have integration with Azure Update Manager, which I don't know if anyone heard about this, right? But it's a component that helps you orchestrate the actual updates to your infrastructure. Typically, this all the things that you would do maybe with System Center, Configuration Manager, Update Manager, sort of lighter orchestration engine that lives in a cloud that can help you patch your servers on premises. And all of the updates that will come down from the Update Manager, because we do have hardware that's validated and basically integrated with third parties, right, that integrate all the firmware updates into one single package. And so eventually, when you do have all of your stores deployed, right, you can come in here, see which servers are updated, which ones are not, one-time update. And it is smart enough to figure out that it needs to vacate one node, update it, make sure that it's solid before it moves on to the next node. And so it's a greatly simplified experience as someone who's managed large, distributed environments, right? This is kind of like the nirvana we've been looking for. And now I'm starting to see this play out with my customers in the real world. Any questions about any of this? No questions. I'm going to keep moving. So we talked about the deployment, the configuration, right? And now we're talking about monitoring, right? We have a centralized view where we can really understand what's going on across all of my Azure Local estate. We can monitor Kubernetes clusters. And by the way, this is specific to Azure Local, but you guys should know that there's an Azure Arc agent for Kubernetes that can run, on GKE or AKS and other platforms that basically would give you that consolidated view with the management, right? And with things like GitOps and policies in Azure, you can actually bootstrap entire applications to these clusters. So after you deployed the infrastructure that I showed you in that template in the previous layer, we can now, wire in the right repos to pull the right images, build our pods, build our architecture, and all of that again is done at scale across all of the environments. And what's also interesting about this is that the way we look at this, right, is that this shows us how is the security of your environment, right? What patches have been applied? And you can set up rules that kind of remind you, like if there's any non-compliant nodes, let me know, and you have to manually update. But it is all kind of centralized. So whereas in the past you may have had to, log into each of these individual branch environments, right? With Arc, we're really aggregating that view into a single pane of glass in Azure, where now you can essentially monitor all of them at scale. And we can assure that all the configurations that we're approving or deploying are in place, and that all of your nodes are in fact compliant with that configuration. So what do you get for your general purpose VMs, right? So with Azure Local. When you deploy virtual machine, and this is the experience that you can see, right? I have a virtual machine that I have deployed onto my Azure Local. Very similar sort of configurations you would see in Azure Portal for your VMs. Also, similar to what you might see in vCenter or other hypervisors, right? It's really to give you that ability for the lifecycle of a VM. But what's interesting is that when you're deploying this VM, you basically are using you can use the same images that are in Azure Marketplace, right? So if you have some special version of maybe Oracle Linux that you like and it needs to be a part of this, that can be part of a deployment. You basically can pull it down into your Azure Local, and then during build time, you can point to, hey, use this image as a starting point. The benefit of using the Arc Azure Marketplace images is that they're refreshed monthly. And if you have a scenario where you can basically replace the image, it gives you a very, very easy way to kind of stay up on top of the security without having to get into the nitty-gritty. Your mileage may vary depending how much customizations and how you apply them to your systems will matter. But basically, it will create the same kind of ARM template, right? And that's what I was saying is, any infrastructure as code will work. In fact, the same way that Azure Local exposes that VM lifecycle, we have something called Azure Arc Resource Bridge for VMware that installs kind of like that control plane VM that talks to the vCenter and gives you ability to, again, do some of this lifecycle management and in VMware world using Arc templates for people that are looking to perhaps move away from their on-premises hypervisors into cloud. This is, a great kind of stepping stone to get into those scenarios where now you're really deploying all this using other technology. So you will have a very familiar Azure experience, and very consistent across all of them. All the same kind of extensions that you would expect to work on the Azure VM. They are extensions for running all that inside of Azure Arc enabled VMs and Azure Local. So just know that we have this model where we basically deploy extensions to the various Azure Arc assets. An extension is like a very small piece of code that basically does one thing, right? And we got things like monitoring. We've got things like inventory collection, and some of that may be part of a function of the baseline agent, but a lot of capabilities like update management will install another extension on that VM that then enables it to take advantage of something like Azure Update Manager, because that's how we can then control it. So same, I would say very similar experience. There's going to be different SKUs, right? On your own hardware, you can carve it up whichever way makes sense for you. But here we're seeing actually that I have a Linux VM that's deployed here. You could see that this came from image from the gallery. We have Microsoft Defender for Endpoint installed. We've got OS updates, as well as patch extension and Azure monitoring agent, right? And that then enables those scenarios for that particular machine to send the telemetry into the cloud to make sure that you have kind of complete view in regards to where it is, and making sure that all the operations are happening as you would expect. For a lot of our customers, right, they view Azure Local as something that can really replace some of the smaller vCenter environments. And to that end, we have a preview of our Azure Migrate tool that allows you to manage the migration process, right? So with acquisition that Microsoft did back in, I think it was 2012, they bought InMage. This is kind of a beating heart. I'm dating myself probably, for what really is enabling us to replicate the instances of a VM, right? So we have a source VM. We install an appliance on your vCenter, and then we have a target appliance that then basically replicates the disk and does all the operations, such as removing vCenter extensions and things like that, to make sure that you get a live VM on your Azure Local. So you have a path to really take advantage of this, right? So it is a important part of this story. And the other thing that we've done with Kubernetes, and this is true when we started releasing Azure Local, right? We now have ability to really provide you with running Kubernetes clusters on this hardware at no additional cost. And that's what we mean. It's built in and included. In the past, there are charges for running this. If you run management of Kubernetes clusters and third-party clouds, we do support that as well. That's more part of the Azure Arc story. For Kubernetes, there is a per core, per hour, per core charge. I think it was like $1 or $2 and somewhere in our pricing. But a lot of this kind of, cross-platform management, if you're staying within the ecosystem, is already provided and free of charge. And the good news is that whatever we're bringing into, Kubernetes, right, this is the very same experience that you would have if you were trying to manage these Kubernetes clusters in the cloud. Instead, it's happening on your local node, right? So you have the same things that you would see in an Azure portal, right? By the way, if you can see the symbol here, it shows you the Kubernetes cluster, the little cluster right there. Whenever you see that disk underneath there, that's an indication that is an Arc resource, means that it's not natively running in Azure, but we have brought it in for management using Arc, so that you have ability to, again, manage it regardless where it lives. Policy and things like that will come down regardless. We also have Microsoft provided storage, right? Container storage interface, so that it's a standard. So we're trying to solve some of the problems people have been having with running Kubernetes. And as I mentioned, all of this is really enabled or ready to roll with any kind of CI/CD with Terraform or GitOps. One of the nice things, right, is with GitOps, you'll be able to add a repository that then instructs the cluster to start pulling down all the images and building out the application. There are Azure policy items that can be targeted at your resource groups that can enable those scenarios. So it truly becomes like a very streamlined deployment, and then post-deployment activities are being orchestrated from the cloud. And I think we touched on this a bit earlier, right? But what you're looking at here, these management services, they obviously are not going to be present on your local instance. We source these from the cloud. Copilot and portal experiences, typically that's all in the cloud, as is Defender, Monitor, updates, orchestration, and policy, right? But all of this does give you, these resources that you can manage. We are also deploying, and this is where I mentioned machine learning, video processing, video indexing type solutions that can run at the edge, and we can bring some of the data services, although I'm not as familiar with that part of the solution. But basically, with Azure Local, right, we can deploy these machine learning models, right, 5.4, all the ones that are open source, to be run for any kind of operations within your local environment. Over here, I mentioned, right, that Azure Virtual Desktop is something that I'm actually piloting with a few of the customers. So unlike the AVD that lives purely in the cloud, the control plane stays in the cloud, but you get a goodness of deploying, locations. And here, as you see, a custom location that could be your site A, site B, as opposed to our regions. And this is the host pool that you typically deploy. And within the host pool, you'll see that there's different resources that make that up, and they will show up as running in a different location, and that's part how we bring this service to the edge. Mentioned a little bit about AI search and machine learning catalog. Again, there's ways to package it. It gets a little bit deeper, but we have folks that have expertise on this. Just know that we do have some great resources, and I'll share one at the end that shows you how you can actually deploy and play with all of this, including this machine learning type opportunities for video detection. So mention a little bit about scale. I don't want to dwell on it too much. I do want you to remember that you need minimum of 2 nodes, right? And for it to be a supported system, test systems, you can get some other exceptions. And these will scale up to 16 nodes per cluster. And part of the reason why it's 16 node is a limit today. Again, it's all the testing that we've done with Storage Spaces Direct, the underlying storage technology that assures the resilience instead of running a SAN. We have high performance disks that basically duplicate content from one node to another. Whenever it comes to deploying, workloads on-prem, right? If you have anything that requires any kind of specific GPU type capabilities, that's also available. You got to make sure that your Azure Local has a GPU in it, and then when you're provisioning a VM, this is kind of the interface you would see for your deployment. You will basically specify that I want to add GPU and how big of a partition. It all depends on how much memory your GPU has in it. But now you can have Esri and other kind of geospatial type solutions that require more horsepower running on those AVD instances, right? They could also be used for other types of solutions. So depending on the application, you have ability to bring GPU compute. So that's a way for us to again bring that into this remote location. And also mentioned earlier in our presentation, right, that we're thinking about these controlled networks and where these devices may live. We know that there are customers that, whether or not their systems truly are connected to the cloud, they're required to keep them isolated. So there is a flavor of Azure Local disconnected. I don't know if you remember from some slides back, I had that control plane up here for connected. Because that is your actual Azure portal, Azure Resource Manager. In a disconnected scenario, you'll get a very sort of similar experience to what you would have a portal, but it actually stays just on that particular instance of a cluster. And just like anything else that's cloud connected, right? Those scenarios won't work, so you won't necessarily get ability to really see anything with Copilot on your Azure Local because Azure doesn't technically know about it. Defender requires real-time evaluation of any kind of security threats and detections because we don't have access to this, or we can't push it into this environment effectively, right? That feature is not available. And because the control plane for AVD lives in Azure, and we don't have an equivalent for that for the control plane for local disconnected, that's going to likely stay as a connected scenario only. But there's a lot of goodness here because, like, for many customers, just ability to again manage those servers and operate them is a value, right? You could even do your vCenter to Azure Local migration in this context and manage whatever that lives behind firewalls, right? So definitely we're thinking about these scenarios. And like I said, we're in a preview phase right now. That means we're collecting feedback from customers. I've got a number of engagements that we're working on to kind of see how well this works. This disconnected scenario actually required a great number of changes to how we actually are provisioning various services, right? How we manage them, and things like, for example, how do you do support gigs, right? Today, if you're in Azure, although now the path to open a support ticket's gotten a little bit more distant because you have a lot of I'll call them helpful wizards that try to suggest solutions that sometimes make a difference, sometimes not. But for this, you would have to basically export logs and all the operational things when it comes to support for this, right, is what's creating what we have to have in place in order to go GA so that customers have confidence, right, that no data from their networks has left at any point. And when it comes to support, we have very strict data governance rules that mandate that the data be used only for the purpose of the case, but a lot of customers, don't need assurances around it, right? And that's why we're building this, and this is still an evolving story. So here you can see that I've got portal.autonomouscloud.private, right? My own DNS name internally for disconnected operations. You can see it's not a full-fledged Azure portal, right? But same concept from resource groups, from the key vaults, subscriptions, and some of these artifacts are going to be available in here. So that is how we can bring that to your environment, including all those options. In terms of how is the Azure Local infrastructure secured, right? So want to make sure that we kind of differentiate between the Azure Local host, right, and guest workloads. But essentially what you're looking at here is our entire security stack, right? Starting with, Azure policy, security benchmarks, security posture management. Of course, all those things are connected scenarios because they talk to our security backend. We have VM isolation, making sure that the VM can be protected from the administrators, right? We also have a hardware root of trust, security assurance, certification to make sure that no one boots these VMs between times where they should be. Just in time, just enough administration, just in time. Just in time. I forget what the JIT PIM, privileged identity management, privileged access management, and the configuration guidelines. All that stuff will basically work. And with Azure Local, we're also bringing security control so that you can really orchestrate that environment the same way you would in Azure. And from what I was mentioning earlier, that as you're looking at your Azure Local deployment, right, we really wanted to do kind of what we did in the in a client space with managing security, right? So forever we had Windows updates and patching has been, Patch Tuesday's been kind of a necessity to operate these types of environments, right? Um, and so in the past, we use Active Directory to enforce policies. Here, I can actually specify the baseline and the settings, right, and make sure that all of my servers are in fact compliant, and I can basically look at it, at the glance and remediate them. This here, Defender for Cloud, that's a bit different component. This adds cost to the solution, but it does give you protections to all the workloads that would run on top of it. And again, with the simplified view, you quickly know where your servers are. So just like forever we manage the desktop and we tweaked how we deploy patches to it and how we manage the look and feel of it. And of course, all these things, that's what I call kind of the white glove service, are all the reasons why the costs for managing those environments have always been high. Anytime you add a lot of management tweaks and knobs, you're opening yourself up to potentially create expectation with your end user population, and then it is what it is. So, but we realized as folks required access from their mobile phones, for example, that we don't need to own your phone. We just need to make sure your phone is compliant, right? And that's really where some of the capabilities that we deployed with managed applications, MAM, mobile managed applications, as well as full-on management of these devices can tell us this. And this is sort of the same kind of a high-level telltale where your security stands on those environments. And so, again, simplifying it, instead of looking through 50,000 different security policies, we define a security posture that we believe provides you with needed security. And then you simply can review this and manage them from here. And so, like as I mentioned earlier, right, this is now viewed kind of from your applications, pretty much everything you would expect to provide on an Azure type environment, you'll be able to do on the VMs or applications running on top of your Azure Local. Some of the things that we are also releasing, right? Software-defined networking gets into some kind of more advanced scenarios, right? We know that RDP port, right, is 90% of cyber attacks leverage that somewhere in the process, right? So however we can mitigate it is great. And I don't know if you have ever seen Azure Virtual Desktop, but the connection architecture is different, right? Because you go to the portal, you first authenticate, once the portal, you see all the resources that you have access to, different desktops and applications. And then when you click on it, there is a handshake that happens that stitches your connection to the back end. So you don't really have like an RDP port hanging up there waiting for somebody to knock on a door or launch a denial of service, brute force attack, and maybe even lock out your particular server account. Now with this, we kind of turn this model inside out, and that really enables us to keep it contained. We also have something called RDP short path, and we also have private endpoints to enable Azure Virtual Desktop in those scenarios. So outside of authenticating to the portal and getting your attestation that you have access to the various resources, you will then have all the connectivity leveraging the local network. So you're not going outside of your firewall and coming back in. But just like everything else that we do in the cloud, right, our pattern is that no ports are open. We initiate all the connectivity into the cloud. So that pattern very much still holds here. We have also with Azure Local introduced now network security groups. If you're familiar with Azure, right, network security groups is kind of like the easiest way for you to manage, the security of your virtual network. You can specify source target environments. And of course, typically when you specify a subnet, VMs get dropped in there, then they have outbound access. With network security groups, we can add different security groups. As a symbol for a security group, we say, hey, we're going to allow access to only front end to go out to the internet. The back end, you cannot. So those rules give you that firewall rules that you typically deploy in a firewall. now running on your Azure Local. So without the expense of deploying firewall, you can make sure that whatever you're deploying there with a template, right, you would specify no outbound IP allowed, and that would basically prohibit those VMs from communicating with the outside world, therefore kind of limiting their surface exposure and therefore their security improving. Hopefully this makes sense. I don't know. Has anybody worked with network security groups yet? Curious. Not just in Azure Local, but like in general. I see Carl's giving me thumbs up. Okay, well, anyways, it's just a way for you to introduce some of those capabilities that in the past would require that you actually run some sort of firewall at the edge site, right? And that's more infrastructure yet. So if you can codify everything that you need into NSGs, that can be part of that same template that gets deployed. Of course. By the way, some years ago, I was meeting with Sony CISO, and he had an interesting tagline. His tagline was, and this is usually directed at their own internal employees, if you're doing your job, I'm not doing mine. And took me a while to sink in when I met with a guy. I'm like, that's brilliant, because that's how people kind of perceive security, right? Yet we all know that without security, there's no business, right? In fact, you guys all heard about Microsoft a Secure Future initiative, right? Security for us trumps everything. We realized that without security, well, we've known that for a decade now, without security, there's no trust. So anytime we get into any kind of planning activities around different releases, right, security things will always trump new features, right? And rightfully so. It makes my world a little bit more painful, but it is what it is. And this is kind of typical view that you would get for your machines. You see, I just realized that we're about 10 minutes before the end. A couple other things I wanted to share with you, right? We talked about being able to run VMs, regardless where we're coming from. So these Azure Local will kind of help you orchestrate all these different systems into one. And then, ability to, again, manage it at scale, becomes trivial once it's all inside there. I don't know if I have anything else that I did want to mention this, right, because this does come up. So with Azure Arc, right, we manage any kind of Kubernetes cluster through Azure Arc with the extension that can live anywhere, so long as it's CNCF compliant cluster. You can run AKS on top of Windows Server, Azure Local, or Azure, and anything that's outside of Azure, we provide that same sort of semblance of the control plane with Azure Arc. So I did want to share this picture because it kind of places where things live in your data center or your location. So again, that's kind of an architectural overview, but you do have a lot of options. And at this point, I don't know if there's any other questions that I could maybe answer at this point.
This is Carl speaking. If you can hear me, I always wonder what's the minimum hardware, if you to just a single node on a laptop is possible, or completely, training lab stuff.
Yeah, if you've got a very beefy laptop, I would say yes. But what would happen, and I'm looking for this resource here because I did want to share this with you, you would be able to basically create multiple VMs and configure them. I have a pretty beefy desktop here on my end that I have 128 gigs of RAM, and with that, I'm able to basically create 2 nodes of an Azure Local instance. And then on top of that, I'm running other VMs, right? So it really is very much a test scenario, right? Because we're using nested virtualization on top of nested virtualization. That's not a performance that any customer would probably want to experience, although in some scenarios that makes sense.
Thanks.
Of course. I'm looking for this Azure Arc resource. This is there's a build package that we had deployed out there. if you have any scenarios that require you to be able to test it, it's a great way to do so without getting any hardware, right? Because you got to figure out, does it even work for what I'm trying to do here? And let's see. So here's is our Azure Stack HCI hardware catalog. That's where you find out what solutions are supported by Azure Local. And then, is it called Jumpstart? Here you go. So if you think this might have some play in your environment, right? This is that second resource that I posted into our chat. And let me reshare my screen so you can actually see what I'm talking about versus me operating in a vacuum here.
Discover Jumpstart. Okay, got it. Thanks.
It basically, there's a number of demos. I mentioned Agora, right? That's where we can basically show the different moving parts and running any kind of video processing at the edge. All of these scenarios have slightly different purposes, right? But Jumpstart HCI box, now Azure Local, right, is going to show you exactly what that looks like. And I used to run a number of these in my subscription. But as of late, I'm having a hard time maintaining it. So that's why I opted to actually deploy Azure Local into my VM environment. Also, if you're looking at testing, there is a guide that shows you how to do it inside of your VM. So let's see. So product group modified some of the instructions that we have. So if you look under evaluate, and I'll share this link here as well, you have virtual deployment, or you can deploy it into Azure. The beauty of this is that it's going to do everything automagically for you. It deploys the entirety of the architecture. So if you're getting started with it and just want to see if the functionality works, that's great. Ultimately, if you're really trying to understand how it works, right, it's this virtual deployment here that guides you how you could do it on your VM. So your beefy laptop can basically create the VMs as described in here, but you do need, I believe it was like 32 gigs of RAM per node. So that's what I'm saying. It's a beefy laptop. I've seen some tweaks, and I think some are even updated into this, where you can maybe reduce those memory requirements, bypass some of the checks, but know that unless you're on a validated hardware that comes from a catalog, right, it's not a supported solution. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to see if it would actually install, and I think I just barely made the requirements. And I think I saw a single node was also possible. Of course, it's not for
testing. Yes, yeah. But exactly. So yeah, you could do less, and obviously none of a failover. But to be honest, this is stuff that Windows has been doing now for a couple of decades, right? A lot of times, folks are just really interested in, how does Azure Local handle. And there's my use case, right? So those are great resources for you to learn from and explore whether those can help you in your environment.
Yeah, perfect.
Awesome. Any other questions, comments, team?
In case anybody wants to ask something off recording, I did